Good afternoon. It's really helpful to get people's attention. I thought this one is for me to try to call to order. Anyway, I'm Yelena Sokova, Deputy Director of the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. I know it's a mouthful, but shortly known for CNS. And it is my pleasure today to monitor the discussion of what I'm sure would be a very interesting panel on the regional approaches to nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. Without doubt, regional peace and security have a wide effect on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. Regional instability and tension, on the other hand, often fuel nuclear proliferation and an arms race. You don't need to map too much, but just looking at the states that are still holdouts from the Annex II, when it comes to their ratification of the CTBT, to see that some of them are also clustered in the regions. Be it Middle East, where we have Egypt, Israel, and Iran, or we look at Asia, South Asia and Northeast Asia, where you have China, India, Pakistan, and Dprk, and the whole conundrum there. The US maybe not necessarily part of these regional groups, but has a very high stake in all of these areas of tension. Although I would say the fact that maybe US has not ratified concerns more about the internal tensions, political tensions, rather than any groupings or regional problems. We also fully understand and recognize the role that nuclear weapons-free zones play in sustaining, maintaining, and furthering nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament goals. And many countries in these regions, in their calculus, decided that nuclear weapons are not part of what that provides for their security. And being free from nuclear weapons also reinforces the anti-nuclear testing role, anti-nuclear testing norm. And many of you probably also aware that a number of nuclear weapons-free zones actually were initiated to prevent nuclear testing and to actually address the legacy of nuclear testing, at least 2 of these zones. We will explore and examine more the linkage between some of the zones and the CTBT and nuclear testing in our panel. But I would also say that the establishment of the zones, the negotiations, the build-up to their conclusion, also served as a trust-building and confidence tools. And in this way, there have been already discussions about, for example, using ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty by a number of regional states simultaneously as one of the contributions to building the nuclear weapons-free zones or the weapons of mass destruction-free zone as we talk about the Middle East. So our panel today will touch on a number of these issues in the discussion, and I'm very pleased to have a variety of experts with both representing some of these regional arrangements, nuclear weapon-free zones in Africa and Latin America and Caribbean here, And those who have experience with first-hand experience in being part of the WMD free zone in the Middle East, negotiations and discussions. And also somebody who is relatively new to the subject, but nevertheless, who has already done some research and developed a number of proposals, how these processes could lead to strengthening this CTBT, the regional approaches, and how the CTBT ratification and entering into force could play a further strengthening role in nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. So let me briefly introduce our speakers today. We will probably follow the way we're listed in the program. So the first speaker would be Ambassador Alicia Buenrostro-Massieu, permanent representative of Mexico to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization and other United Nations organizations in Vienna, and who has been a career diplomat since 1990s and served in a number of countries, but also who, as far as I understand, also contributed to some of the scholarly research in these issues. So, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lena. Very happy to be here with you. I have a terrible cough, so I just hope that I can go through all my presentation without coughing. So sorry for that. And as representative of Mexico, of course, the normal thing was to talk about the Treaty of Tlatelolco and its contribution to the regional and to the international peace and the relationship and mutual reinforcement of the nuclear weapon-free zones. So I would like to go a little bit under the history that gave birth and where we're standing now, and what has been the benefits and the impact of the Treaty of Tlatelolco as well. So as you may probably know, after World War II, there was a huge lack of substantive achievements in the nuclear disarmament process, and the geographic proliferation of nuclear weapons made many states work on ways to avoid nuclear war in their territories, being the creation of nuclear weapon-free zones one of the most important. These nuclear weapons-free zones established several regions of the world, have contributed to end nuclear tests, as you may probably know, to make proliferation of nuclear weapons almost impossible, and to promote the development of societies through the peaceful use of nuclear energy, and to maintain peace and security of the international community. These weapons-free zones became a first step towards achieving a world free of nuclear weapons. Mexico's pacifist vocation, which has been present since Mexico became an independent country, has evolved in a desire to free future generations from the terrific threat posed by nuclear weapons. To achieve this goal, my country has tirelessly worked to ensure that nuclear tests are not carried out in any part of Latin America, as well as to guarantee that nuclear states respect the denuclearization of the whole region. As you may probably recall, after the missile crisis in the Caribbean, thanks to an initiative presented by the Mexican president at the time, on April 29, 1963, the presidents of Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, and Mexico announced their intention to sign a multilateral agreement that would turn Latin America into a nuclear weapons-free zone. The agreement included a commitment to never manufacture, receive, store, or test nuclear weapons or nuclear launch devices. On November 27 of that same year, this declaration received the support of the UN General Assembly, and the Mexican diplomat and Nobel Prize Alfonso Garcia Robles played a key role in the creation of the first nuclear weapons-free zone in a densely populated area. The preparation of the text was entrusted to the Preparatory Commission for the Denuclearization of Latin America, which headquarters were established in Mexico City. The treaty, whose drafting was completed in 1967, was made available for signature on February 14, and at that time it was signed and ratified by 14 countries. The treaty entered into force on April 25, 1969. The treaty established the renunciation of the development, promotion, or authorization directly or indirectly of the test, use, manufacture, production, possession, or control of any nuclear weapon. To ensure the effectiveness of the treaty and in order to prevent its violation by third parties, 2 additional protocols were drafted and they have entered into force in 1992. Additional Protocol 1 is aimed at states that de jure or de facto have territories under their international responsibility in the zone of application of the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Such states legally undertake to respect within their internationally administered territories the status of denuclearization for peaceful purposes. Additional Protocol 1 has been signed and ratified by the US, France, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. Additional Protocol 2 is addressed to the nuclear weapon states. Such states legally undertake the commitment of not contributing to acts that violate the obligations set forth in Article 1 of the Tlatelolco Treaty within the geographical area of application. The state parties to Additional Protocol 2 also commit themselves not to use nuclear weapons or threaten to use them, also known as negative security warranties against the contracting parties to the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Additional Protocol 2 has been signed and ratified by China, the US, France, the United Kingdom, and Russia. The Treaty of Tlatelolco is a significant instrument to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons and promote international peace and security, while at the same time preserves the right of Latin American countries the use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes aimed at enhancing their economic and social development. Moreover, the treaty has contributed to the codification of the most important commitments of the international community regarding nuclear non-proliferation. In fact, it has paved the way for the negotiations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, and established the basic elements of the UN guidelines for the establishment of nuclear weapons-free zones. Additionally, it established 2 innovative aspects that were later included in the NPT, which are the right of the state parties to the peaceful use of nuclear energy, and 2, the responsibility to comply with a verification system. Mexico is very pleased that the Treaty of Tlatelolco is celebrating its 51st anniversary this year. My country will always be proud to have contributed to establish the first nuclear weapon-free zone, and a little more than 5 decades after its entry into force, the treaty, I can say, is a living proof that a world free of nuclear weapons is possible. Any state of the region had developed nuclear weapons, although there were nuclear missiles of extra-regional powers in identified places, as well as certain suspicions of the existence of these weapons in other places within the region. These are some of the advantages to achieve the establishment of nuclear weapons-free zones in Latin America. At the time, there was also an interest of the nuclear powers to avoid the horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons, which contributed to the fact that Additional Protocol 2 came into force long before the Additional Protocol 1. In spite of this, 5 nuclear weapons carried out interpretative declarations at the time of signing on and/or ratification, which in some cases restrict the denuclearization status of the NWFZ. The UN actively supported the consolidation of the nuclear weapons-free zone in Latin America through resolutions adopted by the General Assembly, which devoted 12 sessions to its analysis. The Treaty of Tlatelolco created at the same time the Organization for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean. It currently comprises all the 33 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, and its headquarters, as I have said, are located in Mexico City. It monitors full compliance of the treaty, and in addition to establishing a control system linked with the IAEA. Since 2010, OPANAL has reinforced its presence and promoted the region's position in many international forums dedicated to nuclear disarmament. Since 2014, it launched an action plan to review or suppress the interpretative declarations of the states parties to the additional protocols of the Treaty of Tlatelolco. It initiated consultations to achieve greater participation of the member states without representation in Mexico, and has carried out various activities in the field of education for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, from which I would like to highlight its support of the summer courses on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation organized by my country since 2014 in coordination with the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation and the Instituto Matias Romero for Diplomatic Studies of the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Treaty of Tlatelolco is a cornerstone, as you can see, in international law. It has served as a reference and precursor of the other new nuclear weapons-free zones that emerged later, such as the South Pacific, the Treaty of Rarotonga in 1985, the Southeast Asia Treaty of Bangkok, 1995, in Africa, the Treaty of Pelindaba, 1996, in Central Asia, Treaty of Central Asia, 2006, and Mongolia, which gained international recognition in the year 2000 as a free state of nuclear weapons through the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 55/335. The 5 existing nuclear weapons-free zones plus the Free State of Mongolia form a group of 115 countries which strengthen the process towards the ultimate goal of nuclear disarmament and a world free of nuclear weapons. The OPANAL is actively working to coordinate with the other nuclear weapon-free zones and Mongolia in order to carry out joint efforts that contribute to achieving a universal, legally binding instrument that prohibits nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons-free zones have significantly contributed to the process of nuclear non-proliferation. States participating in these agreements have not only committed themselves not to develop, acquire, or use nuclear weapons, but also they have committed themselves not to deploy nuclear weapons belonging to another state in their territories. At the same time, nuclear weapons-free zones contribute to reduce the role of nuclear weapons and to encourage the reduction of arsenals. The greatest guarantee and security available to the states parties of nuclear weapons-free zones is the legally binding commitment acquired by nuclear weapon states not to nuclear weapons or threaten to use them. Although the objectives of the NPT and of the treaties that have established these nuclear weapons-free zones are similar, both instruments are complementary and mutually supportive. Achievements made through the nuclear weapons-free zones have become more effective, considering that even when non-proliferation has not been achieved through the Universal Treaty, great advancements and progress have been made through regional agreements. Nuclear weapon-free zones are not an end in themselves, but a halfway step towards achieving general and complete disarmament. These zones have given the world the hope while being evidence of the sovereign will of most states of the world trying to create their own common security structures. States must be fully aware that the dynamics leading to nuclear disarmament must be constantly fostered. It would be naive and risky to ignore that the conditions of misleading stability around nuclear weapons can be altered or lost easily. Therefore, it is important to remind that nuclear weapons, the most inhuman, destructive, indiscriminate, harmful, dangerous, and costly instruments created by humankind, were the only weapons of mass destruction that until recently had not been banned by an international treaty. Mexico is honored to continue contributing to a nuclear weapons free world by being one of the main promoters of the recently approved Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, whose objective includes prohibiting the development, testing, production, acquisition, possession, and transfer of nuclear weapons, as well as their use or threat of use. In line with its pacifist tradition, Mexico, probably you know that, was the fourth country to ratify the treaty on January 16 this year. After receiving the Nobel Prize for its role in promoting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICANN, explicitly referred to Mexico's work as always substantive and in close relation to the adoption of the treaty. My country will continue to promote that the inaccurate, false, and dangerous notion that the nuclear arsenals offer stability in order to help the world become free of nuclear weapons. In this context, Mexico, as the main promoter of the first nuclear weapons-free zone in a densely populated territory, supports the creation of new zones of this type as an effective measure in favor of nuclear non-proliferation. My country will always be respectful of the sovereign decisions of the countries that wish to conclude treaties to establish these nuclear weapons-free zones. Finally, I would like to underline that Mexico reiterates its call to nuclear weapons states to review and withdraw their interpretative declarations of the additional protocols of treaties establishing these new weapons-free zones, in particular those made to the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just for those of you who are here participants in the symposium, is what is really outstanding that the Treaty of Tlatelolco, actually establishing the nuclear weapons-free zone, is really preceded even the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its negotiations and entering into the force. So that's really some of the first steps promoting non-proliferation and disarmament. Oh, I will move now to our next speaker, and we'll really keep our questions and comments after everybody finishes their presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Masha Pani, the Chief Director, United Nations Political, Peace and Security Directorate, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation of the Republic of South Africa. And my understanding is you also play one of the leading roles in the organization of the African Union. So the floor is yours, Doctor.
Madam Program Director, thank you very much, and want to take this opportunity as well to thank the CTBTO for inviting us to participate in this second Science and Diplomacy Symposium. Of course, my dearest Excellency has made my job very easy, so she has covered a lot of the things that I was going to say, so I will leave out a lot of things and save time and go to specifics. I think we share a lot in common with the Treaty of Tlatelolco. So, but as colleagues will know, and excellencies here will know, the African Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty was adopted in 1996, and it's called the Pelindaba Treaty. And Pelindaba, in fact, is a place in South Africa. We were the only African nuclear weapons were developed, and hopefully the only and the last. We have no expectation that in the future there could be an African country that has an interest to develop nuclear weapon. And it's not a coincidence that the Pelindaba Treaty was only adopted in 1996. As you will know, South Africa only became a democracy in 1994, and the South African nuclear weapons were dismantled just a few years before that in the early 90s, after many years of a campaign by the African National Congress, which was the liberation movement in South Africa. And by the way, today happens to be an Africa Day. So we're very pleased that as I participate here, the 25th of May has been declared an Africa Day since 1963, when the Organization of African Unity was formed. And also this year marks the centenary of the birth of our global icon, President Nelson Mandela, as well as the 70th anniversary, of course, this year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So in 1998, President Mandela, addressing the General Assembly of the UN, made reference to nuclear weapons and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And he said, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which every human being is supposed to enjoy. However, we also have nuclear weapons that make people to live in fear. And for as long as you have nuclear weapons, people will not fully enjoy their fundamentally human rights because of the fear of the consequences of possible use of these weapons of mass destruction. So we hold this view that for as long as nuclear weapons exist, there's a possibility that they will be used, but also there's a possibility that there will be a proliferation. We don't believe there's a relationship in the sense positively between possessing nuclear weapons and peace and security. We know that nuclear weapon states, they think that they have to have nuclear weapons for strategic security purposes. And our view, and mainly many of us in the continent of Africa, hold a contrary view that in fact, the existence and the possession of weapons of mass destruction contributes to insecurity. Now, our take as part of the Pelindaba Treaty, which creates a zone in the continent, is that zones play a very important role in the implementation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And our take is that the NPT itself represented a grand bargain back then when it was adopted between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. The bargain being that the nuclear weapon states were ultimately going to disarm and dismantle their nuclear weapons, and then the non-nuclear weapon states will not seek to acquire nuclear weapons. And those three pillars of the treaty, in our view, are very important. And that's why our regional zone focuses on these three pillars as well. That's one, disarmament, and two, non-proliferation, and three, peaceful uses. And we think that's very important. As you will know, the treaty came into force in 2009 and has been ratified, or first has been signed by 52. At the time, the members of the African Union or the Organization of African Union were around that number. The number has increased to 55, but 52 are signatories, and 41 have ratified. And those that have not yet done so, few of them have political reasons that are based on principles that I'll deal with later. But by the rest, we are still convinced it's more procedural issues and lack of understanding. And I think that's where cooperation between the Pelindaba Treaty and CTBTO becomes very important. So in terms of the treaty as well, a monitoring body or a secretariat is created, which is called the African Commission on Nuclear Energy. And South Africa has the honor to be hosting it. The offices have been set up in South Africa, and an executive secretary has been appointed, and he will be taking office shortly. Part of the responsibility that the Commission has is to promote the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. As you know, with the socio-economic challenges that we have in the continent, we think that the Commission will play a greater role in leveraging the peaceful use of nuclear energy in cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And of course, after we dismantled in South Africa the nuclear weapons, as you know, we continue to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. As part of that program, we are the largest producer of medical isotope in the world. And I think that for us is very important that the NPT remains intact. However, all the three pillars should be given attention. Now, what is interesting about the Pelindaba Treaty is that it has a relationship, a direct relationship with the situation in the Middle East, the lack of an agreement for the creation of a zone in the Middle East. And for some of you who have the honor to attend the summits of the African Union, whenever this matter is raised, leadership of the continent continue to express deep concern that we have not yet reached an agreement for the creation of a zone in the Middle East, for a simple reason, that the Middle East as a region, historically and geographically, is inextricably linked to the continent of Africa. As much as we seek universality in the continent, that will not be possible until a zone is created in the Middle East. So this becomes a very important matter. It is for this reason, again, that in 1995, Democratic South Africa, participating for the first time in the review conference of the NPT, was central and at the forefront of a discussion for the indefinite extension of the NPT, with that grand bargain again on the understanding that the situation in the Middle East will be given due attention. So as far as we're concerned in the continent, for as long as we don't have that zone in the Middle East, that is an issue of concern for us. Now, so as you will see as well, in terms of the Pelindaba Treaty, there's a relationship between verification by the IEA as well as the organization, and the organizations cooperate as well, and we seek to deepen the cooperation between the IAEA and the Pelindaba Treaty and the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, as well as with the CTBTO. And we're grateful that Dr. Zebo, the Executive Secretary, participated in the last conference of the state parties in March. And in fact, the African Peace and Security Council, after the conference of the state parties, organized an open debate to talk about the role of the Pelindaba Treaty in regional and global peace and security. So this matter in the continent is gaining momentum, particularly because of the relationship as well with the states in the continent who are part of the Annex 2 to the CTBT and who are not in a position for now to ratify, but we're grateful that they have signed at least the treaty. So there's hope that if we continue to have a dialogue and resolve the challenges of the CTBT, they will ultimately be in a position. So here's the situation now that we have no choice, but we have to work closely with the CTBT, that for as long as the CTBT doesn't come into force, we will not achieve our objective, no matter how noble it is, of having universality in terms of the nuclear zone in the continent. So we are directly affected by the issues of the CTBTO and it not coming into force. Now, you will see that in terms of the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons and its adoption last year in June, the African continent delivered the largest number of votes compared to all the other regions towards the adoption of the treaty. Ratification is a process. I've just been told this afternoon that the cabinet of the government of the Republic of South Africa has finally finalized the stages that they needed to finalize to authorize the president to sign the ratification. So in the next month or in the next few days, South Africa will be depositing its instrument of ratification to the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. And that will give us the space to encourage our brothers in the continent, because we wouldn't want to do that without leading by example, without having done that. So in the next few months, we will be redoubling our efforts in making sure. In fact, our expectation is that there's no reason why the treaty shouldn't come into force by next year. And so we're encouraged by the fact that in the next month or so, we will have ratified and we will be able to focus on working with the brothers in the continent to make sure that the treaty comes into force. So in terms of international cooperation, we think as well, there's a nice piece that the paper that the Vienna Center for Disarmament has done on cooperation. And I was saying to the ambassador here, I think we need to start the discussion as well, because more than 100 states are under regional zones. And I think it's very important that we have that discussion. But finally, maybe as a way of concluding, and of course, we work closely in the continent with the UN Security Council 1540 Committee, which we had the honor as well to chair in 2011 and 2012. And we hope that as we go to the Security Council, we will still be able again to make some contribution. But with regard to the future of the CTBTO, let me say the following from the African point of view. You see, there's a sense of unfairness whenever we discuss the current, global, geopolitics and global security. Sense of unfairness in the sense that you have a treaty that has been signed and ratified by an overwhelming, if you look at national politics, if you talk about 2/3 majority, many of us can dream of having any political party ever achieving that. But you talk about an overwhelming support by members of the international community of a treaty like the CTBT. And you have very few states that are frustrating or are holding back the treaty from coming into force. But when we have a discussion about that, you don't get a clear sense that there's this issue, that you got an overwhelming, a highest number ever of states having signed up and ratified a treaty, but it cannot come into force because of a very limited number of states. I understand those dynamics that we created, that you have to have an Annex 2 states and all that. But I'm saying, whenever there's a discussion, we create a sense of collective responsibility. We can't be responsible for the CTBT not coming into force because we have signed and ratified it with many others. Now, we run the risk, and this I must mention, from the thinking that goes on in our part of the world, that at some points we will start thinking about what do we do after such a standoff of many years. Because we can't just continue to have 20 years, 25 years, 30 years of a CTBT that is not coming into force. We can debate about this notion of creating a norm, which we think is an escape and a safe valve for states that are supposed to take responsibility and are not taking the responsibility. However, I must say that the adoption of the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons meant that the tectonic plates have shifted. It can no longer be business as usual in the sense of the international order that we have had in the past 70 years, that there were few states that were dominating it, deciding norms, deciding on standards. And that then really means that we must start thinking hard about the way forward in relation to the CTBT. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mashabane. It was very, very inspiring and important. Now I'll move to Tom's Countryman. I'm not going to try even to compete with Laura Rockwood with her introduction yesterday. By the way, for those of you who were at the event yesterday put by the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, where Tom presented a number of views on North Korea, Iran, and other issues, I think it was outstanding. And from what I understand, the seminar was videotaped, and should be posted on the VCDNP website. So I didn't want to spend too much time introducing, but I would still want to say that Tom is currently chairs the board of directors of the Arms Control Association, and he spent 35 years in a government service working for the Foreign Service in a number of appointments. His last appointments before he retired, not necessarily by his own will, in January of 2017. These last posts were acting Under Secretary for Arms Control and International Security, and before that as Assistant Secretary for International Security and Non-Proliferation. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elena, and I want to thank Dr. Zerbo and the CTBTO, not just for bringing me here, but more importantly for bringing this group together. This is a valuable contribution to creating a new generation of international security experts who I hope will do a better job of protecting global security than my generation has done. As Dr. Kohlglaser mentioned earlier today, scientists have a crucial role to play in diplomacy. When I became Assistant Secretary for Non-Proliferation, I inherited an amazing team that included physicists, microbiologists, nuclear engineers, and they were cross-disciplined. That is, one of my employees had a PhD in physics, but she was my best expert on politics in North Korea and South Korea. One of the best experts we had on the nuclear fuel cycle was actually a lawyer whose job was to negotiate civil nuclear agreements with other countries. So what I needed at that time, and what all these organizations and foreign ministry needs, are foreign policy experts who are not afraid of the science and real scientists who are not afraid of the foreign policy. To say a few words today about the Middle East, the most important issue in the Middle East today is a crisis that didn't exist a month ago and did not need to exist, and that is the termination or the attempted termination of the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action in the decision by President Trump to violate the agreement. As Ambassador Sabatini said this morning, it's not just a political agreement. It is one of the most intensively science-based documents that has ever been adopted. It was informed by the best information of scientists from 7 countries. It explicitly gives transparency at every step of the fuel cycle to Iranian activities. It gave the International Atomic Energy Agency the flexibility to not only design the best methods to assure transparency, but also to adopt those methods as technology advanced. And the United States in particular, but also other countries, contributed immediately with new innovative technological means of monitoring and verification in the case of the JCPOA. It is, in my mind, doubly unfortunate that in deciding to violate the JCPOA, President Trump made a number of incorrect statements about the very strong technical controls that gave those 7 countries faith in the effectiveness of the document. It's a good example of the open hostility to science that is displayed by the current United States government. It is to be hoped that Iran shows restraint in responding to the United States move. The United States cannot kill the deal by itself, but when Iran chooses to stop honoring its obligations, then the JCPOA will exist no more. As Lord Brown said this morning, The problem with the President's decision is that it impairs our ability to work with the United States on a range of issues, and it impairs the world's ability to deter proliferation in the Middle East and beyond. And here there is additional cause for concern that existed even before the President's decision, and that is recent statements by the government of Saudi Arabia about their interest in keeping open the option to develop nuclear weapons. To me, it is disappointing that there has been little public reaction, even from members of the non-proliferation diplomatic community, to these statements by Saudi Arabia, and even during the PrepCom of the NPT held this month in Geneva. It is an active issue in the United States because the US and Saudi Arabia are engaged now in negotiations over a so-called 123 agreement, a civil nuclear cooperation agreement. The US has never before negotiated such an agreement for commerce in nuclear power technology with a non-nuclear weapon state that has openly expressed an interest in developing nuclear weapons. Nor has it ever developed such an agreement with a country that has not negotiated an additional protocol with the IAEA. And so whenever those negotiations are completed, and no matter how strong the current relationship between the Saudi and the US administrations may be, there's a very real prospect that the US Congress would not agree to a document that did not have strong discouragement of such a course of action. Let me talk a little bit about the ambitious proposal, long supported by the United States and by most of the world, to take steps towards establishment of a zone free of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. I led the US effort in this regard from 2011 to 2016. And we made a significant amount of progress, I'd say, in 2012 and 2013. The Arab states and Israel showed important flexibility in budging from previously long-held positions, but we did not close the deal. We did not, of course, when I say close the deal, I don't mean establish the zone. I mean simply fulfilling the first step. That was the task we were given, was to convene a conference to begin work on such a zone. And a number of actors, including myself, bear the responsibility for not being able to close what I thought was a closable gap and a compromise on the agenda for that very first meeting. As close as we came in 2013, I have to say honestly, I think that the prospect of beginning the process, holding such a conference, is unlikely to advance at the present time for several reasons. One is, as I just mentioned, the new interest by a state in the Middle East in acquiring nuclear weapons. Second has been the repeated use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime against its own people. And a further step backwards has been the stalwart defense by Moscow of every such use of chemical weapons by the regime. And in fact, it goes further in that the Russian government uses good scientists to produce false arguments in order for them to claim that it's utterly impossible that a fine young man like Bashar al-Assad ever used chemical weapons. This is a misuse of science that damages Russia's credibility and moves us backwards on the effort to have a zone free of WMD in the Middle East. The second reason it's unlikely to advance is there is no sincere interest on the part of the governments of the Middle East. Yes, there is a sincere interest on the part of those Middle Eastern diplomats who used to have, or still have, a job like I used to have. But among the foreign ministers, prime ministers, presidents, and kings, there is not serious interest that this is a high priority for them. And part of that is that it's very easy and comfortable to sustain a point of principle, a talking point that you have deployed for years and years and years, and that most states are more comfortable doing that than they are in doing the very hard work of engagement and compromise that could lead to a compromise on agenda and allow this process to get started. Nor do I think that there'll be any progress on this at the 2020 RevCon if we have the same procedure among the non-aligned movement that we have had before, which is the non-aligned movement gives carte blanche to the Arab League, that is to Egypt, to decide the entire fate of the RevCon on this one issue. And even if in 2015 most of the non-aligned states were happy with all the parts of the document outside of the 2 sentences on the Middle East, they had no capability to tell the Egyptians, you need to compromise on this point because we like the rest of the concluding document. If that procedure doesn't change, you cannot expect a better result on this issue in 2020 than you had in 2015. Despite the fact that this noble endeavor is unlikely to advance in the format, in the procedure that has been laid out since the 2010 RevCon, it is still possible that things could move. And it depends very much upon states using diplomacy, and that is not just multilateral diplomacy, not just making statements in Vienna and Geneva and New York. For example, it is possible that Arab states could engage privately, confidentially with Israel and revive that attempt to find a compromise on an agenda that would allow a first meeting to take place. Those direct bilateral official discussions have not happened. Second, it is possible that the United Kingdom, which shares this obligation with the United States and the Russian Federation, could take the lead in trying to pick up where we left off in 2013. I don't think that at this moment, either the American or the Russian governments have the credibility to make that work, but the British government might. And third, there is the possibility that I would like to encourage that individual states could make partial steps towards the creation of towards the goals of such a zone. In other words, doing the right thing without immediately getting rewarded for it. And one example would be ratification of the CTBT by Israel, which is expressed a readiness to consider this. Perhaps a more radical idea, and one which I know may not be realistic, but I'd like to suggest it anyway, would be ratification of the CTBT by the Islamic Republic of Iran. This would be more than a tactical move. It would have important tactical and strategic benefits for Iran. It would first point out the disparity between Iranian readiness to meet its obligations under the CTBT and the fact that the United States, which is placing demands upon Iran, is so far unable to take the same step. More importantly, I think that such a step by Iran would reinforce the EU's determination to do everything it can to preserve the JCPOA. I don't underestimate how difficult it would be for authorities in Tehran to make this decision at a point when they are subjected to various forms of economic warfare from the United States. But I would hope that it could be considered. So returning then just to the JCPOA, let me say in closing, it is essential that the European Union in particular do everything it can to preserve the JCPOA. It's important not just for the sake of countering proliferation, it's important not just for the sake of preventing a new crisis in the Middle East. It's important for the credibility of international agreements. It is important for the EU's future credibility in any international situation. And finally, to come back to the theme of this topic, it's important to the credibility of the inclusion of science in finding solutions to highly technical issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Our last but not least speaker is Grace Liu. She is a research associate at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, who graduated like a week ago. Seriously, just from the Institute, and I'm so delighted that she joined our ranks. I will tell a little bit about her, because I think it's important for the presentations she's going to be making. Grace focuses on applying some of these new exciting tools that we have for monitoring and verification, including understanding satellite imagery, 3D modeling, and use open source big data and analytics that comes with that. So, Grace, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elena, for the great introduction. And first, I'd like to say thank you to the CTBTO, especially the CTBTO youth group, Diana, Shahil, for this opportunity to be here and attend and speak to all of you about my research. If you could pull up the PowerPoint. Thank you. So what I lack in years of experience with my co-panelist, I will try to make up with a PowerPoint. So today I'll be talking to you about a paper a couple of my colleagues and I wrote on this past semester on the creation of a Korean Peninsula nuclear weapons-free zone. And with this proposal, then more specifically, the role of open source analysis as a verification measure for such a treaty.
Just say next slide.
There we go. Okay. So why a Korean Peninsula nuclear weapons-free zone? So we've seen since early this year the developments between South Korea and North Korea, essentially a renewing of relations, if you can call it that, more dialogue being opened up between the two leaders, and a really refreshing change of pace in a seemingly unfortunate circumstance between two countries that are geographically very close. So we want to pursue a Korean Peninsula nuclear weapons-free zone because I guess first, it's not the only regional proposal that we've seen thus far. There have been several proposals for countries in the region to engage in creating some sort of peace treaty, disarmament treaty, and usually these include other countries outside of the Korean Peninsula, including Japan, sometimes China, Russia, other parties, typically in the six-party talks. But we really wanted to focus on North and South Korea in particular because this is their region that we are talking about, and especially given the language that was agreed upon in the most recent Panmunjom Declaration, we see that both sides are potentially invested in pursuing some type of bilateral solution to this issue. So you can see the language here that that both North and South Korea affirm the principle of determining the destiny of their nations on their own accord. So I think that's very powerful and something that we really need to keep in mind as we pursue a solution for this region. And so secondly, Korean Peninsula nuclear weapons-free zone, and as we can see through a historical study on previous nuclear weapons-free zones, is that there are these certain parameters that can be addressed and negotiated through such an avenue. So this includes ballistic missile test prohibition, nuclear weapon dismantlement, as we saw in the Treaty of Pelindaba, etc. So a couple of my colleagues and I did a systematic and historical study on previous nuclear weapons-free zones. And here you can see in a very simplified manner some of the provisions that we can take from previous treaties to implement into a potential Korean Peninsula nuclear weapons-free zone. And so, for instance, again, from the Treaty of Rarotonga, we can implement a negotiation and a discussion on a ballistic missile test prohibition. And then, for instance, from the Treaty of Pelindaba, again, the discussion on dismantling weapons that exist in the region. So, in the creation of this nuclear weapons-free zone, one of the most striking, I guess, differences from other previous zones is that if this zone is created, it would be the first zone out of all 6 that currently exist to have had testing done by a country in the region from its own domestic arsenal. And that's not something that we've seen in any of the other 6 nuclear weapons-free zones. So on that note, verification is incredibly important and should be codified in such a free zone treaty. And so on this topic, I'd like to highlight open source analysis for verification of such a treaty. And in that, I will outline a case study that we did at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies starting in 2016. And you'll be able to see how our analysis has evolved over the past couple of years in response to the political evolutions that have happened over the past couple of years. So the first thing I'd like to highlight, and of course I have to highlight Dr. Zerbo as well, I'd like to emphasize the efficiency of open source analysis. So these are just a couple of screenshots of tweets, and I'll put this in perspective of the timeline. So this was the evening before the 6th North Korean nuclear test, September 2nd, and I guess say the evening before because in the California time zone it wasn't September 3rd yet. So my friends and I were on the beach, you know, it's a tough life in California. We were watching the sunset and we were having a great night when we got text alerts saying, oh, there's this seismic event, and it gave us the general grid coordinates, and we saw, oh, well, this is in Northeast Asia. We know that North Korea has been testing and that they were in the past couple months prior to this, looking to test again. So we got really excited, of course, rushed home, and this was within 15-20 minutes of that first initial, notification that we were able to go and using just any mapping software, including Google Maps, to pinpoint where the epicenter of that seismic event was. And then because we were already interested in this Punggye-ri test site, we knew where that location was. So using just Google Maps, we were able to see how close the initial estimates of the seismic event were to the proximity of the nuclear test site. And so this is my first tweet went out in, I think, less than an hour after the first notification. And that was based on US Geological Survey data. And then within the next 12 to 24 hours, we were able to see more updates from Dr. Zerbo, especially just the CTBTO in general, using IMS data to also make estimates on the magnitude, the location of this seismic event. So using that within the next 24 hours, we were able to, through Twitter, of course everyone's favorite social media site, answer questions from the general public wondering, how far apart was the seismic event to the Punggye-ri test site? Do you think it was a nuclear test? And we were able to do this very, very quickly. So the second thing that I'm sure all of us have heard a lot about in the past week is IMS data, of course. And the IMS stations that are diverse and spread around the world that are able to collect data on certain seismic and radiological events. So we can see, and we've learned in the past week that there are different sensors that can detect, geolocate, and assess the nature of seismic or radiological events. And in the Dprk test, and I think we've seen these graphics several times this week, we were able to measure the magnitude of each of the tests, then assess the yield, and then geolocate the epicenters of each. And so another tool that we use is geospatial and topographical analysis in assessing different tests, seismological events, areas of interest. And so here there are two high-resolution satellite images of the Punggiri test site. And so the one on the left was annotated by our counterparts at 38 North, labeling the identified tunnel entrances as well as the spoil, which is all the dirt that's been removed from digging a tunnel, as well as other annotations of buildings of interest, etc. And on the right is the most recent satellite image that we've been able to see of Punggiri. I believe this was taken within a couple weeks. Another example is work done by David Schmerler and Jeffrey Lewis, also at CNS. What they're able to do is, after the Dprk had announced that they would be closing and dismantling their test site, we've been able to monitor this area geospatially in order to see, well, what changes can we see just immediately off the bat using comparative analysis of images over time. So here, I'm not sure how well you can see this, there are zoom-ins of buildings that used to be there, and then they're not there anymore. So we can see that after they had announced that they would close and dismantle the test site, they immediately got to work and started demolishing buildings and getting rid of necessary equipment in the area. So using all of this, IMS data, seismic analysis, geospatial imagery, we were able to construct a 3D model of the Punggiri test site. So in this model, we can visualize, we're able to locate and model the relative size and location of each of the 6 nuclear tests and put them in the space of the mountain using topographical data. So we can see not only can we visualize how big each test actually is, but we can also see, compared to the size of the mountain, how they fit in. We can potentially calculate the overburden of the explosion, which can inform us on whether a cavity may collapse or not. And then we could also see that even after we had put all 6 of these tests, including the largest one, which you can see is the dark red, we can see that there's a lot more space to test. So within even Mount Montop, which is where the main tunnel entrance is, you can see that they have more than enough space to dig more tunnels and to conduct even larger tests if they so chose. So one of the assessments that we were able to make in the building of this 3D model is to see the spacing of the tests and to see that it was vaguely familiar. And I say this in a somewhat negative connotation. So one of the first days after we had built the model, we were, moving around the space, seeing how everything was laid out, and we noticed that these were spaced out a lot like previous US nuclear tests done in the Nevada test site, and specifically P-tunnel, which is one of the US tunnels. So using this, we were able to construct the tunnels in Punggiri, modeled off of the blueprint of P-tunnel, and we saw that they almost fit perfectly to the assessed epicenters of each of North Korea's nuclear tests. So here on the page, you can see that's the blueprint of the US P-tunnel, and on the left was the corresponding tunnel, an assessed tunnel that we built in our 3D model. And you can see that they're very, very similar. And so to tie this back to Tom's points on the JCPOA, we can see that North Korea is very likely using either declassified US data, unclassified data, information that's widely available to further their own nuclear development. And then in this world of, you know, a high transfer of information at very high speeds, we have Facebook, we have internet's accessible almost anywhere. One of the key ways that we should and can further counter-proliferation is to focus on restricting access to fissile material, which is really unfortunate that the JCPOA is, I guess, going the way it has in the past few weeks. But to bring it back to North Korea, so all of these assessments and the 3D models, like I said, we had been working on within the past 2 years. And a lot of this was tested yesterday when North Korea invited journalists to watch their demolition. And then this morning, I was gifted with several pictures from journalists who were at the event of this map that they shared during the dismantlement event. So here you can see the comparison. This is on the left is the Punggye-ri nuclear test site the map that they provided, and on the right is our test site model. And so you can see our tunnel bearings were very similar angles, and we could make this assessment just by using the Ims data, seismic analysis, and using topography and geospatial imagery. And so to close up, I believe there's a few things that we can take away from open source analysis and the role that it can play in verification in the future. So first, given the Dprk South Korean relations, I believe that it's really important for us to keep pursuing those the building of the bilateral relationships and allowing both countries to empower themselves in coming up with an agreement for their region. And then, of course, urge the Dprk to uphold its self-declared test moratorium, and to further reaffirm that, to sign the CTBT. And lastly, I believe that we need to continue to develop and invest in the IMS and the data centers so that we can have good sources of information like this. But to close up, I believe that we have, if North Korea or other countries decide to proliferate and they decide to build tunnels and conduct tests, we have immediate, effective, accurate strategies to monitor these tests and assess the capabilities. And with new tools and emerging technology, by integrating creative approaches to these tools, I believe that we are very capable already of verifying provisions of treaties, and that we're only going to get better from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace, very much. Just wanted to add that you can explore these tunnels if you go to the Nuclear Threat Initiative website. But it is our students and their colleagues who really worked on making a model. You can even see posters from the Korean propaganda in the tunnels. So have fun exploring. But I really thank our panelists for outstanding contributions to the discussion today. And I'm sure many of you are dying to ask questions. So I will not pose my own questions, but I will acknowledge yours. I'll collect probably a couple of the questions. Please tell me who your question is addressed to, and please introduce yourself. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Inga Yumasheva. I'm the member of the Russian Parliament, the State Duma. And you know that my country, the Russian Federation, has signed and ratified the CTBT. And my question goes to Mr. Countryman and is connected with the further process of ratifying. Among the parliamentarians who participate in the second CTBT Science Diplomacy Symposium, there are no US congressmen. And my question is, which US parliamentarians you know who actively support CTBT ratification, and whom would you recommend to invite to participate in such CTBT events? Thank you.
Good question. I will collect a couple of additional questions before we move on, okay? Ambassador Kitano?
Thank you very much. My name is Mitsuru Kitano. I'm a Japanese ambassador here. I first would like to thank four panelists and for their excellent presentations. And as this is a very much valuable occasion to welcome Mr. Tom Countryman and here in Vienna, it is great that now we have you and here in Vienna. So I would like to ask a question about the Middle East issue. And as has been introduced, you have been very much involved for this, and it has been very much a good occasion for us to hear from you. So my question is twofold. And one is that, I suppose this zone issue would certainly be another very much difficult issue when we face with 2020 an NPT review conference. And I see a lot of difficult situation compared even with 2015 and when we discuss about it. But if there is any you can find out, a positive environment, positive element, and we can think about in discussing this issue, and I would like to hear your perspective on it. My second question is about this zone issue. There has been a lot of discussion about who should lead this process. And three conveners, countries in the region, UN, and there has been a lot of discussion. And a lot of ideas has been presented on this issue. So, I suppose it is very much important that we would go beyond to that. But what is your perspective about in trying to going forward? How we can go beyond this who should lead the process issue? Thank you very much.
Thank you. One more question, Ambassador Sultania.
Thank you very much. I congratulate the panelists. Regarding Middle East Free Zone, permit me to complement the picture that our distinguished friend, Mr. Countryman, drew so that the audience will not be misled. First, this Middle East Free Zone was one of those conditions for indefinite extension of NPT, and those who have committed, they have not done their commitment, fulfilled their commitment, and this is one of the serious threats to 2020. Second point, I was in 2010 among the Friends of President, which were successful to have the final act of the conference, and that conference decided in 2012 to have a conference for the first time in the history on Middle East Free Zone. And the conveners, US, UK, Russia, were only mandated to do the administration work for finding a host and arrange administrative work. US had not any right to unilaterally postpone this conference, which was unanimously decided in 2010. It happened. The whole world criticized, even UK, Russia, European, but US didn't care. The conference went to archive. Then there was another attempt which was very dangerous, and Mr. Countryman, I assume that he was admiring that process and was regretting why it didn't work. It was a historical mistake. Disregarding that decision, they invited Israel and they went out of UN umbrella and decided to have this meeting. And that was a mistake because we were going to have that meeting. Of course, Israel could have participated and everybody could express, not deciding on agenda before the conference. That was a historical mistake. Thank you. The second point on the second, presentation. While I really congratulate the work which is done by students in the Mountain Institute and these kind of things which was presented, I'm a little bit worried as a matter of principle. Because, as she said today and last time, even she said that we are encouraging the journalists to go when they go to North Korea to try to get some photos so that we have complementary information about what is the situation, so on and so forth, and open source. It means that we are doing a parallel things to the international organizations which we have established, and we have full trust on CTBT with all scientists and equipment to give us the yes or no. Otherwise, the public will be confused with this kind of news and information to social media. She said, and of course I admire her work, that she said that we will immediately dispute our information, our findings to media and to the people. whom they should trust, the CTBT result or the media or the information in Monterey Institute or whoever in other parts of the world about other countries. Therefore, we have to be very careful. And I have a lot of information about allegations which prove wrong, and the whole countries and the IAEA were, in fact, jeopardy in the credibility. I have a lot I can discuss later on out of this meeting and explain you what has happened in the IAEA because of the false information by non-experts. We are talking about science and technology. These are careful scientific matters. It cannot be just sitting down and looking at satellite imagery and decide something which might lead the people in the wrong path. I'm grateful to you, but please talk to me and I explain to you many examples that you might hopefully be convinced. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I wish your questions were a little bit shorter. We're really running out of time. So, maybe what we will do, it seems like most of the questions are addressed to Tom and then to Grace.
We welcome him back.
Huh?
We welcome him back.
Yep.
I'm thrilled to be back. Are there members of the U.S. Senate who support the CTBT? The answer is yes. We had made a serious effort in the last 3 years of the Obama administration to create the conditions in which we could get a positive vote, which requires 67 out of 100 senators. In the end, we chose not to attempt a vote because although we thought we could get more than 60, we weren't sure we could get 67, and to put it for a vote a second time and not to succeed a second time would be very dangerous. It could be many years before we could try again. There are certainly a number of members of the Senate who are interested in the work of the CTB and the treaty of the CTBT. There's many senators who like to come to Vienna. As valuable as this conference is for many reasons, I don't think that it would have changed any particular senator's mind in either direction. On the Middle East, Ambassador Catano, is there any positive news? No. Who should lead the effort? That's a very good question. I think the intent of the Egypt and the Arab League and non-aligned delegations on whose behalf they speak has decided that the right thing to do is to hand this extraordinarily difficult task to the UN Secretary General. I don't believe either the previous Secretary General or the current one has any interest in taking on Mission Impossible. And it would not actually advance the goal. The facilitator, Finland, did a lot of valuable work, but it remains the responsibility of the 3 depositories to convene the conference, and they should do it. I want to thank Ambassador Sultania for perfectly illustrating my central point, which is there is a right way to do this, and there is only one way to do it. And if the Israelis don't agree, we don't need them. This is the point of view of Iran, which refused to participate in any structured dialogue other than the structure that they said is legally, diplomatically, theologically correct. It was obvious to the co-conveners that if there is not an attempt to fulfill the mandate of 2010, which said arrangements freely arrived at among the parties, there would be no useful conference. Yes, we could have had a conference at which no effort was made to persuade Israel to attend. And nobody would have been happier than the Islamic Republic of Iran, because it would have given them talking points for months to come. So there has to be some creativity in diplomacy. There has to be some willingness to talk to people that you don't want to talk to. I think we learned that in the course of the JCPOA. And an insistence that there is only my way to do it, and I'm not going to talk to anybody other than my way to do it is exactly the reason that we haven't had the conference so far.
Thank you, Tom. Grace, are you going to take the question?
Sure, yes. Thank you, Ambassador. I personally, on a personal level, I really do share the same concerns about academia and especially working on so closely with policy issues. But I have to say that that's a privilege that I've gotten to enjoy, is to work for a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank where I haven't felt pressured to sway our assessments one way or another. But I think that also highlights the importance of academic reviews and being able to share your research and your methods with other academics and researchers, so that you can look at each other's work and criticize what could have been done better, maybe give some suggestions for next time. But in the past, at least in my experience, in my past couple of years at CNS, there, of course, have been a lot of contesting views, especially on policy recommendations that we may produce from our assessments. But I haven't seen, there generally isn't a lot of dispute on our methods, our sources, or our technical analyses. And I'll emphasize that we always remain transparent on our methods, on what information we use, and always make that readily accessible to whoever is interested in reading it. And we want to do this for the sake of education as well, not necessarily for policy implications, but to have this type of analyses readily available for anyone who is willing to look into it a little bit further and try to educate themselves. So in that, I will also say that we will, of course, admit when we are wrong. And I think that's something that you can't necessarily say for everyone in this field. So again, I appreciate the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies for giving us such an opportunity to do as unbiased research as we can. But thank you for your question.
Thank you. I think we're almost there, but if everybody agrees to stay a little bit longer, if there are further questions, I'm prepared to do so. I'll take 1, 2, 3, 4 questions. Hopefully very quick. Please introduce yourself. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Arif Surahman from Indonesia. We know numbers of countries pursue their capability to be to achieve their capability to nuclear technology without any intention to be a nuclear weapon country. But there are some pillars of CTBT, that disarmament, NPT, and peaceful uses. So how can we build a perspective deal between NPT and peaceful uses? While we know that it's almost contradictory or something. Thank you.
Next question, please.
Thank you. My name is Anna Lukashina. I'm from the Russian Permanent Mission. I take the floor to react on Tom Countryman's accusation of Russia supporting use of chemical weapons in Syria. I have to say that we believe that that's an unfounded accusation of Syrian legitimate government in use of chemical weapons against its people, and it is the fact that Russia does not support the use of chemical weapons in Syria. I would say that over the past 3 years, Russia has repeatedly proposed adopting a UN security resolution, or at least a statement of the UN Security Council President condemning acts of chemical terrorism in Syria and Iraq. Unfortunately, all Russia's proposals to this effect encountered stiff opposition from a number of Western countries, including the United States. They preferred to insist on their groundless accusations against alleged use of chemical weapons by Bashar al-Assad's legitimate government. Thank you.
I have a question, just a comment. One over there and the next person.
Hi, I'm Evan Snyder, a geology student at Southern Methodist University. My question is for Grace. We learned a couple days ago that with the IMS not being able to detect radionuclides from the 2016 and 2017 nuclear tests by Dprk, that IMS data could have at best been ambiguous about what those events were with just seismic. From your perspective, could these open sources have provided sufficient evidence to justify a on-site inspection if the CTBT were in force? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Over there, one more question.
Hi, my name is Andrew Conan. I'm from the United States. And my question has to deal with something that Mr. Countryman brought up with the civil nuclear cooperation assistance agreements. I think recently you may know that the US and Mexico have started talking about some civil nuclear cooperation assistance. President Trump earlier this month actually sent a message to Congress urging them to form a 1, 2, 3 agreement with Mexico. And I'm interested in how you see these civil nuclear cooperation agreements with countries like Mexico and countries that may be a little bit of more of a concern, how you see them fitting in with the overall disarmament efforts such as the CTBT. And I would especially like to hear some perspective from the Ambassador of Mexico on how this may help with future non-proliferation efforts in the region. Thank you.
I also saw Des Brown wanted to add something. Right now or after the question?
No, I'll do it right now. I just want an opportunity to, I think people say now, 2 fingers, on CNS's contribution to the interpretation of open source material. So I do this because we at NTI partially support this work, and we carry on our websites, as you have already pointed out, Elena, some of the product of that work when it meets our exacting and demanding very high standards. And we do this for a number of reasons, but let me just share some of them with you with all due respect to those who criticise this, and I think rightly raise issues which should be at the forefront of our mind. First of all, CNS makes an extraordinarily disproportionate contribution to the training of future generations of people who can do exactly what this symposium is about. And that is be comfortable in the diplomatic environment with science and be comfortable in the scientific environment with diplomacy. Secondly, they expand the knowledge that people who are not familiar with modern technology should have of the value that it can contribute to our knowledge base. And thirdly, we only allow this because we only allow anything on our website which is from open source material and therefore is capable of being interpreted by people themselves if they want to and they have access to it. Because open source material is just that, it is there. And if it is to be interpreted, it better be interpreted by people who know what they're doing, informed by the multilateral and other organisations who we give responsibility to. So we heard from Grace's contribution that she was drawing heavily on the work of the CTBTO and clearly has a personal relationship with Lucina Serbo through the youth group here with Lucina Serbo and many of the staff of the CTBTO, which can only be a good thing. And under the supervision of people whom we trust and are trusted broadly in the world across partisan divides. You know, and one final point about CNS is concerned is that it has students from across the world. So this isn't, these are not people are and your organisation, you know, which works with it, have people from across the world. You have no closed door to people in terms of their nationality. So I just think that if we have to live in the modern world that we have created by the web and the internet of shared information, then this work needs to be done. And my final point is, and I subscribe to this in every part of the work that I do with universities and others, if this work is done in the public space by people who are connected to public institutions, it should be published. Knowledge belongs to everybody. And if people have it, they should share it. And they should share it for the reasons that Grace put forward, for educational purposes, and for it to be tested by other people and commented upon.
Thank you, Des. Much appreciate that shout out and confirmation of the work and confidence in what we're doing. But I want to give the floor back to the panelists, first of all, to address some of the questions that were raised in the last round, but also if they want to add something to what they've said before. Unfortunately, I'm not taking more questions. We're already past the time of the panel. What I would do is probably start from this side. Maybe you could address some of the peaceful uses in NPT.
Thank you very much, Director. I think if I understood correctly the question from the colleague from Indonesia on peaceful uses, I think, as you'll know, the NPT itself guarantees the inalienable rights to peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And our concern, and which is still going to be part of a major part of the discussion in 2020, is that peaceful use does not equal proliferation. And this is a concern as well. I understand that the issues of the Middle East free zone dominate the discussion and a determination whether the review conference is a success or not. But there's also a concern from many of us that there's a disproportionate focus on non-proliferation and nuclear security, with no similar focus on disarmament. But the NPT guarantees that right, and many of us exercise it, and we know the benefits. And I think to a certain extent, the JCPOA was important in that respect of guaranteeing that right. Thank you.
Ambassador?
Sure. On the NPT and the Pacific uses, we in Mexico believe there is no contradiction whatsoever. On the contrary, they are complementary, and nuclear energy can always be used under strict controls to assure the development of our country as well. So the controls are already established by the NPT, and complying with them, signatory countries show their commitments towards non-proliferation. Thank you.
I'll give the floor to Grace. There was a question to you and then to Tom.
Thank you. So to answer your question about just having some of the sensors being able to detect some of the information from the couple of the recent nuclear tests, in our analyses, we like to use a redundancy of sources. So not only imagery from from different satellite companies or sources, but also seismic data from multiple sources as well. So like I said, not only IMS data, but also USGS and other and multiple seismologists who do the analysis also. So in that regard, that is, I guess, a portion of information that we could use if we had it, but because we're able to use other sources of information and hopefully use creative analyses with new tools, we can try to fill in the gaps of information that we don't have to still make the similar quality assessments even without, a certain piece of it. But just to close out, I again want to encourage everyone to go to the MTI website, check out the model for yourself, have fun with it, and yeah, thank you.
Tom, you had a number of questions to you.
I did? I only counted one.
One, okay.
I heard a comment that I found utterly unconvincing. I'd heard it before, but it doesn't change my view. Question about 123's, civil nuclear cooperation agreements. Mexico has never indicated it's interested in enrichment or in building nuclear weapons. It's a great partner economically, and there should be no problem with doing a 123 agreement. In general, the policy pursued by the last few administrations in negotiating civil nuclear agreements was that we did not encourage the spread of enrichment or reprocessing technology anywhere. There is such a surplus of enrichment capacity in the world now, primarily in Russia, that it makes less than zero economic sense for any country to spend billions of dollars building an indigenous enrichment capacity. This was always an economically crazy idea on the part of the Islamic Republic. No economic justification whatsoever, and it only increased the justifiable suspicion that this was a lot more about prestige and keeping open a weapons option. Now, Saudi Arabia may have the same misguided notions about keeping open a weapons option about prestige. They may have enough money to do something that is economically foolish. I don't think that they have enough money to do something that would be so foolish in political or security terms.
And from the Mexican side, I can only tell you, we've been working on this negotiation of this agreement for a long period of time. For Mexico, it's very important. In the end, we see it as part of strengthening our bilateral relations. It's for the usage of peaceful uses, and it will give us access to technology, materials, best practices. So we see it as a very good step forward in consolidating our relationship with the U.S. and in particular on the peaceful uses of energy. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank to all of our panelists. This was an outstanding discussion, very rich presentations, and I wish we had more time, but it's probably my fault as a moderator not to really keep everybody to the signed 10-minute limit. But anyway, I would appreciate if you join me in thanking our panelists.
Before you all go, let's give a round of thanks to our moderator as well. And thank you for conducting what was really an excellent and informative panel. And I'm sorry you didn't have a bit longer. We do have a break now, though, of about 20 minutes, and we will resume at 1:30 p.m. with our final panel of the day on the Dprk. Thank you. So, dear participants, please take your seats before we start the final session of today and of this week, discussing the Dprk. What do we know? What do we think? What do we do? Which will again be moderated by Dr. Pierce Corden. Before we go ahead with that, just a couple of things. First of all, next week, Monday morning, as you know, we will be visiting the Atom Institute here in Vienna. You will find the lists on the doors, on the entry doors of those who have signed up for that trip. We will be leaving from Wagramerstrasse outside the Vienna International Centre's Gate 1 at 9 a.m. sharp on Monday morning. So we do ask everyone to try to be here by about 8:30 so we can load the buses accordingly. We will send out a further reminder of that over the app. And talking of the app, I think we're going to ask a couple of questions. Again, we haven't done that yet today. So we've got a couple of DPRK-related leading questions that we can ask before we move into the panel. Let's get them up on the board. So open your apps, refresh them. And we'll have the first question here. Two of them are opinion-based and one is a true or false type answer. In the next 5 years, how likely do you think it is that North Korea will sign and ratify the CTBT? So you can choose between very unlikely, unlikely, likely, or very likely. Let's keep that up on screen. Okay, it's working. We see what's developing to be a clear response, maybe. So, setting the scene maybe for this panel, we find that roughly 2/3 or slightly more than that of the participants here in the room with their apps open, at least, think that the DPRK is very unlikely to move forward on the CTBT in the next 5 years. Right, let's move to the second question. This is a general knowledge question here. In which year did the DPRK conduct 2 nuclear tests? I expect to see a pretty clear, correct response right here. No replies yet? Okay. Maybe we haven't been doing our job well enough, is what I'm thinking. So the majority of people voting so far think that it was 2016, and a minority think it was 2017. Maybe I can ask the panel if they know which year was correct. Something you could start with, maybe Dr. Gordon. Final one. So this is again a more of an opinion question. Do you believe that in the next 10 years, any other state besides the DPRK will conduct a nuclear test? Yes, no, or unsure? So we see a fluctuating degree of pessimism and optimism. With some uncertainty. Can I just ask somebody who chose option A to raise their hand? Anybody? who chose option A, do you believe that some other country will conduct a nuclear test? Okay. Can you tell me which country you were thinking of and why?
Well, I'm not sure. I cannot say it for sure. But anyhow, with the new NPR, the possibility is there. They leave the possibility over there.
Okay. Okay, I think we'll leave it there. We still find a 42% majority for no, at least. So I'm going to now hand over to the panel, to Dr. Pierce Corden, for his introductions and for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have yet another distinguished panel of experts to provide us a basis for further reflection and discussion, this time particularly on the question of what do we know about, what do we think about, and what do we do about the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We had the good fortune of already having had a very good introduction to some of this material in our last panel, in particular in terms of what's been happening at the nuclear weapon test site in the Dprk. So we'll just proceed right into the work of the panel, and I'll introduce the panelists as I ask them to take the floor. First, we'll turn to Alexander Bell. She's the Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, and prior to that served as the Director for Strategic Outreach in the Office of the Under Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, where I had the pleasure of working with her from where I was sitting at the American Association for the Advancement of Science at the time. Before joining the State Department in 2010, she was the project manager at the Plowshares Fund and a research assistant for nuclear policy at the Center for American Progress. So, Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Pierce, and thanks again to the CTBTO for inviting me to join this panel on North Korea, though I have to say I do have the feeling that it's some sort of test. Like they wanted to see how it would perform on a panel where the best possible answer to what's going to happen next is a shrug of my shoulders. I actually, at one point today, thought the best thing I could do is just read my Twitter feed in real time to you as the most accurate representation of what's happening. The truth is, anyone who tells you that they know what's going to happen with North Korea probably also has some magic beans to sell you, because we are in completely uncharted territory. So how did we get here? On March 8th, as most of you know, President Trump surprised many in the United States, around the world, and even in his own administration by accepting an invitation from the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to meet for face-to-face negotiations. Despite many of the risks involved, most observers viewed these possible talks with cautious optimism. That's because while a diplomatic solution may be difficult to attain, it is far preferable to what would undoubtedly be a catastrophic war. It was always clear to outside observers, but not necessarily to President Trump, that no single meeting was going to solve this crisis. In the best case scenario, the summit would have been the start of what would have been a lengthy and complicated process. Rather than focusing on a grand bargain, many experts thought the initial focus of the North Korean discussions should be on extending a freeze of the North Korean nuclear and missile testing programs for as long as possible, with the ultimate goal being a denuclearized and secure Korean peninsula. That process, again, would require months, if not years, of work and close coordination with allies and partners in the region. So what derailed, possibly, the summit on June 12th? First, the Trump administration chose to interpret North Korean statements too positively when it came to things like denuclearization, and too negatively when it came to the standard insults that Pyongyang has perfected over the years. That led to a situation where there was not a shared concept of exactly what would happen at the summit. Second, no matter the perceived change in tone, North Korea was never just going to give up a nuclear weapons program it spent the last 20-plus years creating, at great cost to themselves, for some hazy future economic relief and security guarantees. Achieving comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible disarmament will, again, require years of work, compromises, and guarantees of regime security. Third, referencing Libya, as both Vice President Pence and Ambassador Bolton did, was the quickest way to remind Pyongyang that they could give up their nuclear weapons program and still face regime change. Following those statements, there was an uptick in rhetoric that grew worse until yesterday, as we all know, President Trump sent a letter to Kim Jong-un declaring that the June 12th summit was off. That prompted the North Koreans to send a response last night that simultaneously insulted and flattered the US president, but essentially said they're ready to talk whenever and wherever. Then this morning at 8:14 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the president tweeted the following: "Very good news to receive the warm and productive statement from North Korea. We will soon see where it will lead, hopefully to a long and enduring prosperity and peace. Only time, parentheses, and talent will tell, exclamation point." If you feel like you have diplomatic whiplash, you are not the only one. One of my friends in the field referred to this whole process as a goat rodeo. That may not translate here, but it is in fact an apt description. What troubles me now are reports that the Trump administration thinks they can go back to maximum pressure and get the North Koreans to the table on better terms for the US. The problem here is that North Korea is actually stronger today than it was on March 8th. Kim Jong-un has met with Chinese President Xi twice, participated in a historic globally televised event with South Korean President Moon, met with Secretary Pompeo twice, and held the world's attention as he destroyed his test site on his own terms. The White House even gave him equal representation with President Trump on a ridiculously premature challenge coin. Kim now has a nice physical keepsake showing him face-to-face with the US president without ever having to meet him face-to-face. So again, we don't really know what's going to happen. Apparently in a press conference just before this panel, President Trump told a reporter, quote, "Everybody plays games, you know that," end quote. I sincerely hope that games is not the official US plan, and I hope it's not the North Korean plan either. As far as where we go, I think allies and partners in the region need to pressure the United States and Korea to continue to move towards diplomatic discussions. And for the North Korean part, they've played their cards very well to now, but if diplomatic efforts collapse, they could be playing with fire. For the US part specifically, it's time for the president and his advisors to focus on the nuts and bolts of how to make a real and lasting deal to reduce the North Korean nuclear threat. That means empowering technical nuclear policy experts and doing some serious preparatory work. It also means getting people responsible for the collapse of the last major North Korean deal off of TV, and it means respecting allies in the process and not catching them off guard with erratic moves. I look forward to our discussion, and when it comes to the future, I will reiterate my initial idea of thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Next, we'll turn to Anton Klopov. For those of you who are not that close students of geography, just recall that the Russian Federation actually has a common border with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Anton is the director of the Center for Energy and Security Studies, a member of the advisory board under the Security Council of the Russian Federation, chairman of the Moscow Non-Proliferation Conference, which I had the pleasure of attending last year in honor of a very fine diplomat, Roland Timurbayev, who's now in his 90s. He's the editor-in-chief of the Nuclear Club Journal and the editor-in-chief and co-author of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Encyclopedia, and leads the projects of his institute to pursue Track 2 dialogue on pressing nuclear issues with experts from Iran and North Korea. And he's paid 7 separate visits to Pyongyang in 2012 to 18. So I think he may have a little bit he can tell us about the place. So Antoine, over to you.
Thank you, Pierce. I was told to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. I will try to be brief. First, so-called Olympic diplomacy opened the window of opportunity to reduce tensions on the Korean Peninsula, to reestablish the goal of complete denuclearization, a long-term goal of complete denuclearization of the peninsula, and make some practical steps in the direction of denuclearization in the near and mid-term future. I would like to remind where we were last December. The tensions were quite significant in the region, and I think many experts expected that accidental military crisis could start any minute. So the positive developments which took place early this year, as I mentioned, gave us a chance for some progress with regard reduction of tensions and denuclearization in the region. Second, during the recent 5 months, important steps have been made by Dprk. I would like to remind that Dprk announced moratorium on nuclear tests, moratorium on ICBM launches. They announced dismantlement or closure of Punggiri nuclear test site. And also I should refer to, I think, quite an important statement which was made by North Korean representative in Geneva on May 15th in support of international efforts to ban nuclear tests. I would like to share our experience as part of the Moscow Non-Proliferation Conference, which Piers just referred to. For last number of years, we were trying, and I think successfully were trying to engage North Koreans into discussion on CTBT issues. And for example, during the last conference, October 2017, we had a very good panel with Executive Secretary Zerbo, with Hans Blix, with Sig Hecker, some other members of GEM group, as well as representatives of North Korea. We do believe that it's quite important to involve North Korean officials and think tankers, scholars into discussion, debate on CTBT-related issues. Though, I mean, our experience was not an easy one to persuade them to speak on those issues. I should also mention that it's still not clear whether the US-North Korean summit will take place. As Alex mentioned, President Trump most likely has changed his mind overnight, and we don't know what his position will be tomorrow. So we have, I think, 2 options as of now. The first one, the summit will not take place, which I think now is quite likely. If this is the case, I think our immediate priorities should be damage control. And first of all, I mean to keep a moratorium on nuclear tests and ICBM launches alive. Because let's imagine that North Korea will resume nuclear tests. Of course, it will increase tensions in the region significantly again. The same true, by the way, with regard new sanctions or maximum pressure on North Korea. If new unilateral sanctions will be introduced, will be imposed on North Korea, I'm almost sure that North Korea will decide to retaliate. It could be a satellite launch, it could be a missile launch, and of course, it will not help to continue the dialogue which we had during the recent months. The same true with regard, by the way, military drills, because we know that US ROK exercises are quite regular in the region, and if we will have the same the same scope of exercises in summer and fall, of course, it could negatively impact on the dialogue as well. So if there is no summit, I think the priority should be on damage control, no moratorium, to keep moratorium alive, no new sanctions, and countries of the region, ROK, China, should play an important role to keep the dialogue with North Korea. I personally believe that President Moon made a very good job during the recent months, and I hope he will continue despite of the news from Washington. And Russia has its own role. As some of you know, Russian Foreign Ministry this week announced that Foreign Minister Lavrov is going to visit Pyongyang soon, though dates have not yet been announced. Next point: if the summit between US and North Korea will take place, I hope it can open an opportunity for multinational, multilateral dialogue on further steps in the direction of denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. I visited, as Piers mentioned, last time Pyongyang in March, and we received a number of indications that North Korea is ready to make some steps. They were trying to avoid to mention denuclearization, but it was clear that they are open to make some steps which can be interpreted as steps in the direction of denuclearization. My personal impression, North Korean colleagues themselves do not know yet how far they're ready to go with those steps in the field of denuclearization. So my formula is that it should be step-by-step approach. And as I already mentioned, North Koreans made a few very important steps. I think we should support them to make further steps. Somebody could call it a phased approach. I am also fine with that formula, but the idea that we should not try to develop a roadmap which will expect that North Koreans will be completely denuclearized within the next, let's say, 1 or 2 years. As already Alex mentioned, Alex mentioned 25 years, I believe even more than that, to reach the level where they are. So it will not be an easy process for them to roll back. What is important that they learned lessons from JCPOA a lot. And even despite of the recent withdrawal from the deal, I do believe that we should keep it in mind that they were following the negotiations and implementation of the deal quite closely. In our communication, they answered us a number of times on some details of the negotiations, and I think we should try to build on that. Of course, the level of nuclear industry development in Iran and North Korea are very much different, but I think we should try, if the summit will take place and if we will have a chance for multinational negotiations, we should try to apply some elements from JCPOA negotiation or some elements of philosophy of negotiations to dialogue on Korean Peninsula. I will stop here and will be happy to go in further details during Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Anton. We'll turn now to our third speaker, Gina Kim. You're third. Who is a research fellow at the Korean Institute for Defense Analyses, specializing in U.S., North Korean, and Korean relations, nuclear non-proliferation, and Northeast Asian security. She is a member of the Advisory Committee for the Ministry of National Unification and a member of the National Policy Review Board for the Prime Minister's Office. She is also serving on the Blue House's Public Information Committee. And before I give the floor to her, I will let her think about a question that I carried through from my previous session related to the platinum standard, and that's to pose the question for everybody as to what border is the 37th parallel. Not the 38th, but the 37th. Just think about that. The floor is yours.
I thank CTBT for having me in this important gathering. The questions that I got in advance was the security implications of the advancement of North Korea's nuclear and missile program, and other concerns related to diplomatic efforts going on. So regarding the first question that I got, I can say, against the U.S., North Korea does not have first strike capability or second strike capability in terms of the size of the nuclear assets, the accuracy of the information about the targets in the U.S., and also the penetration of the delivery means, and lastly, the survivability of its nuclear assets for retaliation. And so I would say regarding North Korea's nuclear deterrence posture, I think it is between existential deterrence and minimum deterrence. That means it is unlikely that North Korea will use nuclear weapons in a crisis. However, we are very concerned about the possibility that the mere existence of North Korea's nuclear weapons in place can have some significant bearing on how a crisis can be managed in future. Because it is possible that North Korea can coerce the alliance to have a political settlement rather than ensuring controlling North Korea when crisis happen. So sometimes we tend to focus on somewhat emotionally charged rhetoric coming from North Korea. And North Korea once mentioned that it can use nuclear weapons against harbor or airfield to block any force flow from the U.S. But basically, when we look into the whole dialogue, the whole rhetoric coming from North Korea, especially since 2012 under Kim Jong-un regime, we can understand that the primary focus, the primary role of North Korea's nuclear weapons is for strategic deterrence against any external threat to the regime. So, South Korea's point of view is South Korea has been exposed to North Korea's nuclear and missile threat for a very, very long time. But we are very concerned about a new variable, which is the development of ICBM, which can target continental U.S. Because of this change, South Korea is very much concerned about two possibilities that can take place, that can occur between the two allies. The first scenario is possibly unilateral use of military options against the Dprk by the U.S. without any prior consultation in a crisis. The second scenario can be, like I said before, having a political settlement without full consultation with its ally between the Dprk and the U.S. These are potential concerns that some of the South Koreans had in mind. And now North Korea is trying to have a dialogue on denuclearization, which is good. And this is not the first time, I can tell you, that North Korea suggested talks on denuclearization. In 2013, in June, North Korea offered talks on denuclearization, but at the time, North Korea refused inter-Korean dialogue. That angered the U.S. government. So North Korea learned a lesson. It is not possible to rule out South Korea from the whole discussion. And in 2015, in January, North Korea again proposed talks on denuclearization. At the time, North Korea offered a freeze for freeze option, which means the U.S. cancel or suspend joint military exercise. Then North Korea will put some moratorium on its nuclear test, which also was rejected by the U.S. government because it means an exchange between illegal activity and legal activity. So North Korea got a lesson that it is not a good idea to put alliance issue on the table in the first place. And now we're talking about denuclearization talk. Possibly can take place in the future, I hope. But this dialogue can have some security implications as well, because North Korea wants to sign a peace treaty, but South Korean government and the U.S. wants to talk about peace arrangement first. We are talking about a very comprehensive measures, including military CBM, confidence building measures, and probably arms control or arms reduction. But North Korea wants to sign a document that can replace arms treaty first. So we have that issue. And that relates to changing the role of UNC, UN Command on the Korean Peninsula, whose mandate is to monitor armistice agreement. So without armistice agreement in place, the role has to be changed anyway. And that kind of dialogue can affect the whole discussion about the change of USFK, US forces in Korea. Somehow. So we have to think about that kind of discourse coming out of the whole the process. And that relates to South Korea's agreement on condition-based transfer of wartime operational control, which is currently held by the US commander. So the condition here means that the possible change of the security environment or South Korea military's force enhancement. Anyway, if the condition changes, we have to rethink the option of wartime OPCON transfer. And that also affects the issue of extended deterrence provided by the US government. And we have the South Korean military and the US military have worked so closely about how to strengthen the existing extended deterrence to keep military posture as strong as possible. So all these dialogue issues can be part of the whole dialogue on denuclearization as well. However, I think perhaps we need time to think about how to approach this issue. And perhaps the recent canceling of the US Dprk summit, which was supposed to be taking place in June, cannot be a worst scenario, because I think the worst case that I think is the walking out of the meeting without anything tangible, because that can provide the U.S. Legitimate ground to think about non-diplomatic options, including military options against the U.S., saying that it is the last resort because we exhausted all options on the table. Because I am telling you this because there are huge uncertainties in the future. First, let me just lay out several questions. The first thing is we have different concepts about denuclearization. North Korea wants no hostility, end of hostility from the US government. That means denuclearization. But we are talking about denuclearization in terms of dismantling nuclear programs in the North. Second, we have different ideas about the sequence of action. We want denuclearization first, and then moving on to improving inter-Korean relations or US Dprk relations. But North Korea wants a normalization of its diplomatic relations between the US and Dprk, and it says it will think about denuclearization in the past, at least. And we have different understanding about the principle of the implementation. We want to have a very comprehensive one-shot deal, which means we want to put everything in one basket and talk about step-by-step approach, how to implement all the agreements. But North Korea wants to talk about certain issues first and move on to the next phase. So we have different approaches on how to implement the agreement. And lastly, the thing that I'm very much concerned about is a detailed roadmap. We don't have that clear idea about the detailed roadmap, especially where to put signing peace treaty in the continuum of different actions. That can be a very critical issue because, well, like as I explained before, signing a peace treaty can change a lot on the Korean Peninsula. So we want to focus more on confidence building measures first, and put signing peace treaty in the later phase of the whole the process. But I think North Korea may have a different idea. Like such concerns, we have huge uncertainties in the future, and I think it is better to have some time to think about a better way to close the gap in our understanding of denuclearization. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very clear that there are, shall we say, complications that need to be thought through as we seek to make things better on the Korean Peninsula. Our last speaker this afternoon is Tong Xiao, who's a fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, based at the Carnegie's Tsinghua Center for Global Policy in Beijing. His work focuses on strategic security issues, including nuclear weapons policy, arms control, non-proliferation, missile defense, space security, and China's security and foreign policy. He is an associate editor of the Journal of Science and Global Security, which is based at Princeton, and a member of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. So, Tom, to you.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think I will start by saying that I believe North Korea already acquired a rudimentary and credible nuclear deterrent. On the nuclear warhead design, after 6 nuclear tests, North Korea has already moved from testing a fission bomb to a much more complicated hydrogen bomb. The fact that North Korea did that shows they were already confident about their capability to make a fission bomb small and light enough to be mounted to the top of a ballistic missile. So at least I think they already have a militarized fission bomb technology. And in terms of the delivery vehicle, North Korea has 3 successful ICBM tests. Of course, there is still some uncertainty about whether some remaining technologies, including the reentry vehicle, works perfectly. Maybe the North Koreans themselves don't know because they also had very limited capability to receive the telemetry data from the descending reentry vehicle after it fell below the horizon. But that doesn't matter. From the deterrence perspective, North Korea does not need to have a 100% reliable system. As long as the United States wouldn't be able to completely rule out the possibility that the system might work if actually used, the US would have to treat the threat very seriously. And that uncertainty already creates a credible deterrent for the North Koreans. And the case is similar to the Chinese case, in which we, the Chinese, depended on a very small number of highly vulnerable liquid-fueled silo-based ICBMs for many years in order to deter the United States. So for North Korea, I think clearly North Korea has a 2-staged strategy. In stage 1, North Korea did everything to acquire a basic nuclear deterrent capability as soon as possible. And after achieving that by the end of 2017, North Korea has now moved into phase 2. The objective at this stage is to retain its core deterrent capability, and on that basis, to try to address all the negative consequences created during the nuclear and missile development i.e. the international economic sanctions and political isolation, and to try to develop a normal and a stable relationship with international community. So North Korea is not going to trust any external security guarantee because by definition, security guarantee is reversible. Even if the United States is willing to take concrete measures to withdraw its troops from the Korean Peninsula, to even withdraw advanced military assets from Guam, etc., those efforts can be easily reversed. So the bottom line, I think, is North Korea has no plan for immediate denuclearization. North Korea wants to return its core deterrent to hedge against any future uncertainties. And a more important point is the US has very little to do about it. The US has already lost its coercive leverage over North Korea. The smartest move by the North Korean leader is to come to China to meet with Xi Jinping and greatly improved China-North Korea relationship. And now North Korea has built an international image of a responsible player, wanting to exercise self-restraint, wanting to stop provocations, wanting to engage, wanting to embrace the outside world, wanting to deal with everyone, to use diplomacy to resolve the disagreements. And North Korea now has very good relations with China, Russia, South Korea. If the US, even if the US wants to resort to the military option, there will be no international support for that at all. And I can imagine China, Russia would want to mobilize their military forces to signal to the United States in order to deter any US military maneuver against North Korea. And also, there is almost zero chance for another UN Security Council resolution to impose additional economic sanctions on North Korea. In other words, I think North Korea has already secured a soft landing. The maximum pressure campaign has already reached its maximum level. My personal assessment is under existing sanctions, the North Korean economy would survive. There would be no imminent economic crisis as a result of existing sanctions. And over time, North Korea can always come up with new ways to evade existing sanctions, to sell products to other countries that are not yet on the control list, and to depend on Russia, South Korea, China for more economic and trading cooperation. So regardless of whether we are going to have a US-North Korea summit, I think the basic gap in the positions of North Korea and the United States would continue to exist. With that said, I think North Korea might make 4 concessions in the nuclear area. One is to make a clear and high-level political commitment to the eventual goal of denuclearization, which Kim Jong-un already made during the Inter-Korean Summit meeting. Second is North Korea might take measures to freeze its programs. The recent suspension of tests, the close down of the test site are all measures in this area. Thirdly, maybe we can convince North Korea to give up some non-essential capabilities. For example, North Korea's SLBM program, the submarine-launched ballistic missile program, doesn't make much military sense. North Korea's submarine technology is very vulnerable, facing the advanced anti-submarine warfare capabilities of the US, South Korea, and Japan. So I think if we put real pressure, North Korea might be able to give up those less important programs. And fourth, I think we can force North Korea to substantiate its non-proliferation commitments, setting up domestic rules on export control, maybe even complying with the MTCR rules and the missile technology control regime obligations, etc. Even though the nuclear concessions North Korea would likely make are very limited. I think North Korea wants to depend on a wide range of non-nuclear concessions in order to have the international community to accept this reality. North Korea, I think, is likely to take measures to reduce its conventional military deployment, improve political relations with other countries, improve human rights, and most importantly, promise to commit to economic development. And for China, I think the last point is very important. North Korea is now willing to start a strategic transition to pivot to economic development, to introduce more radical measures of economic reform and development, liberalizing its economy, building stronger ties with the outside world. That offers the most important long-term opportunity to transform North Korea from an isolated pariah state into a more normal country, a more open country. And that would help address the fundamental cause of the security dilemma over the Korean Peninsula. The fundamental cause of all the troubles in this region is North Korea's paranoia. And that can only be addressed by encouraging more interactions between North Korea and the outside world to help North Korea develop a better understanding of international system. So looking to the future, I do believe even if there is no summit, North Korea might continue this current charm offensive, would continue to refrain from major provocations because first, it doesn't have the technical need, and second, it would still want to present a good image in front of international community. And China, I think, would very much want to seize upon this longer-term opportunity to transform North Korea and to do so together with Russia and South Korea. Last point. Can we really resolve the North Korean nuclear problem in the future? I'm not very optimistic. Another basic fact is there is deep mutual distrust among all the major players in this region. Take the example of China, US, and North Korea. China doesn't trust the United States doesn't trust China. Both countries increasingly see each other as their most important long-term strategic rivals. And China always suspects that the US is simply using the North Korean threat as an excuse to deploy military capabilities in its region to contain China. And China doesn't trust North Korea either. China, for a long time, knows that North Korea has this ambition to play a role of a strategic balancer in this region. And North Korea doesn't trust China. North Korea has long historical grievances towards China. So, from the Chinese perspective, immediate North Korean denuclearization is very unlikely. And a nuclear-capable North Korea is probably going to be the reality in the foreseeable future. Given this, I think the priority now becomes how to make sure a nuclear-capable North Korea has a closer relationship with us than with the United States. So I think geopolitical consideration will become increasingly important in the policy deliberations about North Korea. On that pessimistic note, let me conclude. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we have a very full menu of ideas, thoughts, concepts, proposals concerning the future, and we have a reasonable amount of time to pursue those now in terms of questions that you might have to offer. And we'll start here, and then back there. We'll come around this. Yes, sir.
Thank you all very much for your presentations. I'm Stephen Herzog from the United States. I have two quick questions about both the best case and worst case scenarios here. My question about the best case is for Alex, and that question is if you think it's possible, what do you think might be some elements of a mutually acceptable and hopefully durable agreement between the United States and the Dprk? Possible elements to think about involve, what might be a mutually acceptable definition of denuclearization, incentives for the Dprk to change course, and verification measures. And on the worst case scenario, my question is for Tong, and that is, if heaven forbid this breaks down diplomatically and the military option is actually considered by the United States, and we do see some sort of implicit threats in the recent Trump statement, the role of China appears for many observers to be somewhat of a black box. In various settings that I've been in and things that I've read, Chinese officials have consistently reiterated their commitment to their bilateral security treaty with the Dprk. And I'm wondering, what might this mean? You started the conversation by talking about perhaps a demonstrative mobilization by the PRC in the event of the United States considering the military option. I think that's a good start to think about. So what is your assessment of the current contours of the China-Dprk military relationship? Thank you.
Great, thank you all for your comments. My question is for Anton. First, I'd love to congratulate CNS on all the early work and current work that you guys are doing to build actual, real peer-to-peer relationships with North Koreans. I think it was most evident at the Moscow Non-Proliferation Conference. My question is, through your work, what do you think are the best incentives to make the path for North Korea easier, not necessarily towards ratification of the CTBT, but to at least begin to mention the CTBT explicitly in its statements, to perhaps make maneuvers towards becoming an accredited observer state, or, of course, a signature or ratification? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Louis. I am a political science student at the University of Vienna, and I have a question for Ms. Kim. First of all, I want to say I am a huge fan of your personal work right here, and the KIDA. I encourage everybody to go have a look at their stuff. It's an amazing resource. I would like to know, what were the major mistakes that the US has made in approaching the North Korean nuclear weapons program over the last 25 years? Since we've seen kind of everything from carrots to sticks to whatever this is right now. So I'd just like to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
All right, let's take those three questions and then we'll proceed.
So when I said that we're definitely in uncharted territory, that was specifically focused on the politics here. When it comes to substance, we have a lot of experience, whether it's US-Russia bilateral arms control agreements, the agreed framework, and JCPOA. We can draw a lot of lessons learned of what was working with those agreements and what wasn't working with those agreements, and apply it to a possible real negotiation with the North Koreans. I think as far as the concerns the US has about previous agreements where it's sort of a back and forth and it sort of slowly peters out and then nothing good happens. I think focusing on testing and fuel production first, given that those two things are pretty necessary for heavily advancing a program. Perhaps if CTBT accession isn't on the table yet, maybe getting CTBTO inspectors into North Korea to do some actual technical verification. And then for fuel production, maybe it's not an immediate cutoff, but maybe it's a monitoring program that goes into place first. And I think that's where we can make some progress if in fact we do get to the table.
So I think the second was for you. Okay, Tom?
Thank you. There is always this issue of North Korea-China Friendship Treaty, which is still valid. But I think in recent years, the Chinese government tried to downplay the importance of this treaty. Chinese experts even argue that, especially if North Korea was the one that provokes a conflict, China would not be bound by this treaty to intervene on North Korean behalf. But this hypothetical scenario is different, which is the US is now thinking about a preemptive disarming military strike against North Korea when North Korea is taking every effort to try to be reasonable and self-restrained. So China probably will blame the US for being the one that provokes. And also any US military strike against North Korea runs a huge risk of escalation. Even a limited strike could easily escalate to an all-out war between the two parties, and maybe even escalate all the way to the nuclear level. And if nuclear weapons were used, Chinese interests would be directly affected due to the fallout, etc. So I do believe in that case, if there are indicators of US military mobilization, China and Russia would also mobilize their militaries to send a signal to the United States in the hope of deterring US plan. I can also imagine China making official warnings against the US taking such actions. The United States in previous years has always valued coordination with China in case of a military contingency on the Korean Peninsula. The US cares about the risk of misunderstanding between Chinese troops and American troops in a war on the Korean Peninsula. So if China strongly opposes, I think there will be greater risk of US-China military confrontation due to lack of coordination and due to misunderstanding. I think in anticipation of those risks, it's unlikely the US would go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you. Gina? Yeah, Gina?
First. Okay. Thanks for the question. I'm not the right person to make some criticism about U.S. approach to North Korea, but if you ask, I will say first problem was inattention, especially during the first nuclear crisis in 1990s, because at the time, Bush administration and Clinton administration did not pay much attention to this crisis on the Korean Peninsula. The second problem was coordination issue, because the real problem is a structural problem, because we have multiple players in place and we have to coordinate all different interests among different players here. And the third issue is, U.S. engaged in negative interactions with the Dprk. I can tell you this because if the President Trump's decision to cancel the June summit was a simultaneous response to North Korea's rhetoric, I think it is a little bit worrisome because we are going to see such a stop and go in the future as well. The immediate response from North Korea shows that there was no actually threat or warning this time. But North Korea wanted to mention that it was a part of the harsh rhetoric coming from North Korea was part of negative negative interaction, which is an exchange of terse remarks on both sides. So North Korea mentioned both sides are responsible for this outcome. And at the same time, North Korea mentioned that the cancellation shows the fact that there is no trust between the Dprk and the US. So North Korea emphasized there should be a talk in the future to resolve this problem. And at the same time, North Korea mentioned that the regime change, actually, this is a pressure point because the role of nuclear weapons for the North Korean regime is to keep the regime in place. So the primary focus was to maintain the Kim regime. So I think we have to be careful about North Korea's rhetoric, but we should not be truly obsessed with the rhetoric coming from North Korea, because sometimes we have to understand it's a typical North Korea's diplomatic tactic to show that it is taking the initiative. But if you see the long-term goal, I think we have to understand at some point why North Korea is doing this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anton, I think you wanted to say a few things. But
that was a question to me with regard to our experience to deal with North Koreans. First, with regard the nuclear test moratorium and North Korean policy with regard to CTBT, I have an impression that there is a flexibility with how North Koreans see the moratorium, what it actually means. I would like to remind that in some languages, when they were speaking about the nuclear test site, they use the word closure. In some languages, dismantlement. I would also like to remind that originally they planned experts and journalists during the events related to dismantlement or closure, which yesterday took place in Pungiri, but finally they decided to have only journalists. Last year we negotiated details of North Korean participation on the panel on CTBT until the very last moment of the conference preparation. So again, it is sensitive, but I don't think that there is a consensus or clear roadmap what kind of steps they can do with regard CTBT or nuclear test moratorium, what they cannot do. I do believe that they are open for, could be more open for more interaction with CTBT Preparatory Commission, particularly I think with regard some training programs. But to have that, to have more opportunities, I think we need a progress in US-North Korean dialogue, because I do believe with no summit between Kim Jong-un and Trump, it will be very difficult for North Koreans to make next steps in the field, in the direction of nuclear, of denuclearization.
thank you, Anton. Now, there were several hands in the back I want to get. Yes, you, and then two here, and then we'll keep going. So three of them. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Max Höll from Germany, Tong. This question is for you. I was very much intrigued by what you said about North Korea being paranoid. So my question is, why are they so paranoid, and would joining the CTBT lock the Dprk into any sort of disadvantage at all, given that the treaty text is very clear that a state retains the right to withdraw? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Heather Vokush, and I'd like to return to Trump's statement a few hours ago saying that the talks are still ongoing and that the summit may still happen on the 12th. And I would like to quote, he said, "We're talking to them now. They very much want to do it. We'd like to do it." So I'd like to talk about doing it. Now, Mr. Klapov delineated a step-by-step approach for DPRK. My question is, what can be done to encourage, if not force, Trump to stop playing games and to step up and just do it, especially in light of the fact that military profiting donors are certainly presenting a different opinion, as are hawks such as Bolton? Thank you.
Thank you very much for all speakers. My name is Song-hee Koo. I'm from Korea and based in Vienna. I have two questions. First, very simple, and one little more complicated. I believe in all negotiations, we everybody on the table has to be ready to compromise, and we must not just force North Korea to give up on everything at our time. So my first question goes to Mrs. Gina Kim. Are we actually ready to guarantee the regime survivor, which I believe is their main political reason? And are we actually ready to honor the deal under every circumstances, like possible scenarios such as JCPOA? And second question goes to all speakers. I do not think Libyan model is ideal in the situation. First of all, it is simply unrealistic. It reminds North Korea of the face of Libyan leader and the regime collapse. Therefore, I do not think it is really doable for international community to force them to adopt Libyan model. And second of all, for the humanitarian reasons, I do not think it is fair for pouring comprehensive sanctions on the innocent civilians of North Korea, and after the regime collapse, and we make the failed state, and actually they could suffer even more after the disarmament. So what could be the idea and fair in terms of human security of disarmament of North Korea? Thank you.
So let's see how we can respond to those three questions. Alex, do you have anything you want to offer?
Good Lord, if I knew how to get Trump to stay on message and be disciplined, I think I'd be a millionaire. I think the key here, if there is one, is an appeal to his vanity. I think he very much wants to be seen as a sort of once-in-a-generation deal-maker to accomplish something his three predecessors failed to accomplish. I think that message repeated to him can possibly induce him to listen to the technical experts around him about some of the complicated processes that are ahead of him. I think Pompeo, actually, Secretary Pompeo also wants to be seen as a deal maker and is interested in succeeding where his predecessors have failed. So I think that's probably where I'd sort of rest the case there. But he is nothing if not mercurial. But it does, in addition to his statements, Secretary Mattis also indicated to the press that he thought there was some good news on the horizon. So they've already got the coin, so maybe they want to stick with it. I do just want to touch on something really quick that came up at the beginning about an implication that, perhaps the U.S. would be on a list of returning to testing. I can tell you assuredly that the fine people of Nevada will not abide a nuclear test there, and nor will the fine people of any other state in America. And so thank God for democracy.
I think it's more up to U.S. colleagues to comment how to stop Trump from playing games. I think one of the problem, which how I see it from Moscow, I can be wrong, but how I see that Trump and his administration ignore U.S. experts on Korea. I know many very good U.S. experts on Korea, but I'm not sure that they have close access to the current administration, which is a problem. The good news that Track 2 in the past worked. It was quite active between U.S. and North Korean colleagues. I hope it will continue because, of course, this is an important channel for a dialogue. With regard, again, I would like to be back to step-by-step approach. I don't have a feeling that North Koreans are ready for a comprehensive deal, but as I mentioned, I do see some indications that they are ready for some further steps of progress. And if summit will take place, I think it will open an opportunity for a dialogue to design, to develop those steps. And as I mentioned, GCPOA experience can be used, for example, to separate core issues from others. Because as some of Japanese colleagues who are in this room well know, I share this view with them. I do believe that abducted issues is important. But I don't think that we should discuss it jointly with nuclear issues because it makes things much more complicated. As in the case of Iran, human rights issues are important as well as with regard to other countries. But the success of GCPOA was we were able to identify the core issues and to remove all others. So this is why, for example, if the dialogue, a multinational dialogue will be resumed, the abducted issues could be discussed simultaneously, but in the next room. Because North Koreans have their own issues from the past with regard to Japan. And it's also true with regard to some other issues which North Korea may have with other countries. If we will link nuclear issues with all others, there is no chance for progress. If we are able to separate them, I do believe that we will be able to identify some further steps. Tong Zhao mentioned a few of them. I do believe that, for example, North Koreans may consider application of safeguards to some facilities, not to all, but to some. But of course, as it was mentioned, this is a matter of compromise. It's not for free.
Thank you, Anton. Tong, maybe I'll turn to you next.
Thank you. Why North Korea is paranoid? Different people have different answers. My answer is because North Korea has been isolated for too long. Isolation is the fundamental cause of misunderstanding and paranoia. China is a country that is much more open than North Korea, but still, even in China, security experts still embrace deep distrust towards the United States, for example. And I would raise one personal case, which is in China, there is widespread belief among the security community that the United States has a long-standing strategy to gradually deploy missile defense assets in Asia-Pacific region to undermine Chinese nuclear deterrent. I personally don't believe that theory because I stayed for 6 years in the United States. I watched with my own eyes major disagreements among American officials and experts themselves. Sometimes the disagreements were so serious they became personal enemies. So there is no way the U.S. has a coherent strategy, long-term strategy to gradually deploy missile defense around China. But my friends in the military, they don't speak English. They rely on translated materials. They can't travel to the United States. They can't talk to American experts because of secrecy regulations. They do believe the U.S. has that long-term strategy. So isolation, lack of free communication, lack of openness is the fundamental cause of paranoia and misunderstanding. I think this applies to North Korea deeply. I think current North Korean leader knows he needs to rule for another few decades. He knows in order to have a sustainable governance for himself, he needs to narrow the economic difference between North Korea and the regional countries. Every North Korean defector says they have watched some South Korean TV dramas, read some international news. They know about the difference of living standards and economic status between North Korea and outside. So current leader, I do think he has this ambition to at least open up North Korean economy in the long run. We should take good use of this opportunity. Second question, constraint on North Korea consideration about joining CTBT. I speculate that the greatest concern for North Korea is about the on-site inspection provisions might be abused and might be used as an excuse to collect intelligence everywhere in North Korea. And after CBT enter into force, other countries would have the power to suggest challenging inspections in member countries. CBT is not going to enter into force soon, despite my hoping it will happen soon. But for on these national security decisions, every country becomes extremely risk averse. So how do we reassure North Korea that this inspection regime wouldn't be abused is highly important.
Thank you. Now, Gina, if you have any thoughts.
Well, to be honest with you, it is my personal view, but we cannot guarantee North Korea's regime survival 100%. That's not possible because it is all about threat perception, and it's hard to change a threat perception, right? That's why North Korea want to talk about peace treaty in the first place. In 2005, the six-party talks made a joint statement, and what was included in that agreement was such that we can discuss this issue at a separate forum. So this time, North Korea want to put this agenda on the table to be discussed seriously. Because of the threat perception that North Korea has so far. And the threat to the North Korean regime involves not just a military issue. When North Korea mentions hostility toward the regime, it talks about issues like human rights violation accusations and information flow to North Korea, for example. So it is very comprehensive issues that we are talking about. And perhaps multilateral guarantee can be one form to encourage North Korea to think positively about denuclearization and peace arrangement on the Korean Peninsula. But North Korea may not believe political commitment because possibly they don't know what's going to happen after there is a government change in the U.S., for example. So I mentioned the CBM, military confidence building measures. I think it is very important in the long run. To be honest with you, I'm a constructivist, so I can tell you in the long run, by focusing on this confidence building measures, we can deal with some issues in order to increase some trust between the two Koreas or among three players who are dealing with the nuclear issue. And regarding the Libya model, the focus is slightly different between the U.S. and North Korea. When the U.S. talks about Libyan model, it talks about the deal made in 2003, which means the Libyan government gave up its WMD program and the lifting sanctions followed. But North Korea, when talks about Libyan model, it focuses on what happened in 2011, change of the Gaddafi regime. So the focus is different here.
Thank you. Now, there was, yes, one here. And anybody else, or shall we close it down? Please, go ahead.
My name is Inga Yumasheva. I'm the member of the Russian Parliament, the State Duma, and my question is to Gina Kim. How do you regard the role of parliamentarians in the resolution of the problems of the Korean Peninsula, if there is any added value in your opinion? And I'll tell you that not so long ago, Russia's parliament has announced an initiative to become a mediator in order to start the dialogue between the parliamentarians from North and South Korea. What your recommendations would be in this case? Thank you.
Nikita Symbolist, Institute of International Relations, Nuclear Research University, MIFI. I would like to thank all the panelists and moderator for this presentation. And my question is probably may refer to all the panelists. So you mentioned that if North Korea is positive in terms of the denuclearization, what format should the negotiations over this issue take? For example, what countries should be involved? Must there be several bilateral negotiations, treaties, or just one comprehensive one? What possible international organizations should take part? What about the, as Ms. Bell said, the possible monitoring system of North Korean activity can take place? So, etc., etc. Thank you.
All right, I think that then we'll close the questions, and I will turn to the panelists and we will then be just about done. So I think first the question was to you.
Yeah, my answer can be very simple because the role of the National Assembly in South Korea is very important in a sense that we need a bipartisan support to this whole denuclearization dialogue and inter-Korean relations improvement because we, to be honest with you, we have different voices in South Korea. On the one hand, we support more pressure on the Dprk, but on the other hand, some others support the ongoing dialogue, the peaceful dialogue. So these kind of this contention between the two sides can affect the domestic opinion as well. In the long run, we need a sustainable domestic support. So I think in order to have a bipartisan support to this whole process, I think the role of a National Assembly is very, very important. Thank you.
So Tom, do you want to respond to anything?
I think at this moment, neither party is ready to make radical concessions. North Korea is now ready to surrender its nuclear weapons. U.S. is now ready to cut its security alliance with South Korea or to withdraw troops from the peninsula. So what we can hope for the near term is mostly a symbolic agreement that declares the ending of hostilities, committing to using dialogue to resolve differences, etc. And then after achieving that symbolic political agreement, try to focus our resources to concrete steps of engagement, even if those measures would be limited to freezing and capping North Korean capabilities for the moment, because the best way to build trust is through long-standing operational level engagement, working on specific issues, and there is no real shortcut for the lack of trust among the major parties. And it takes time to build trust. Why don't we start that process through initial steps of freezing and capping North Korea's capabilities?
Thank you. Anton?
Yeah, first I would like to react to the question of Ms. Yumasheva with regard to the interparliamentarian context. I do think that any contacts with North Korean colleagues are important, and again, based on our experience, even to be on the ground in Pyongyang and to see what is going on there. There are many rumors what brought North Koreans to the dialogue early this year. One of the rumors because of the sanctions. We were in Pyongyang in March. In March, we were not able to feel any sanctions, any impact of sanctions in Pyongyang. Yeah, probably later sanctions will have their own effect, but not as of March. For example, you can see how many taxis are on the streets. My personal surprise was then we went outside from the hotel and there was a medical university. It was about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, and there was a line of taxi cars which were waiting probably for students or professors of the medical university. When I was a student, I even did not dream about using a taxi on the way back from the university. But despite of the fact that the prices went up for gasoline in North Korea, according to some estimates, now the gasoline is 3 times more expensive than in the past. People still use taxi cars a lot. The same true, you can see that the restaurants are full with locals, not with the foreigners, and there are many other signs. So my point that it's very, very helpful to be on the ground, to have the dialogue, but also to see what is going on. Because for a number of years, there was a myth that regime on the eve of the collapse, though the reality was quite opposite. The economy was improving. So I do believe that any exchanges, any contacts with North Korea are critically important. As I mentioned, I think track 2 is between think tanks is important. With regard to the format of the dialogue, Again, as I mentioned, I do like the GCPOA model, despite of the fact that the US withdrawn from GCPOA. I still believe that this is a very useful diplomatic experience. What countries should participate? Well, most likely those which were part of six-party talks. Some issues could be discussed bilaterally. For example, as I mentioned, I don't think that issues related to abducted people or so-called comfort women should be discussed in the multinational forum. I think it's quite sensitive. It should be discussed between Japan, North Korea, probably South Korea could participate as well. There are some other bilateral issues, and of course, the US-North Korean dialogue should be the leading one as part of this multinational discussion, because if you would ask North Korean about threat perception, so number one will be US, number two will be US, number three will be US again. You can continue, but the answer will be the same. We can like it, not like it, but this is how they see that, and we cannot ignore that.
Thank you, Anton. Alex, you have a word?
Yeah, I would just say I don't think enough focus has gone into this yet. I think we're just too early in the process. But ideally, you want to hit the sweet spot between not having too many cooks in the kitchen, and but nevertheless having buy-in from all the relevant players. So I'm hoping that that is the focus going forward.
Thank you. And Tong has a final thought he would offer.
Well, given this is a science and policy symposium, I really want to raise one issue that might affect future near-term future negotiations with North Korea. Even though I don't think North Korea is likely to resume nuclear tests, ICBM tests, I do think there is a real chance that North Korea might restart its civilian rockets and satellite launch program. In a recent meeting with North Koreans that I attended, they expressed that possibility. So I think there is an urgent need for people who have the technical expertise to start looking at technical options to separate military missile programs from civilian rocket programs. North Korean officials at the same meeting also indicated an interest in working together with other countries in exploring those technical measures to make sure that their civilian rocket programs wouldn't provide a disguised opportunity for their military program to advance. I do think those technical measures exist. We should start working on them and making them ready before this was raised and became a political problem. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our time and the end of a very instructive and interesting dialogue about how to move ahead and related issues. I won't let you be hanging about my question about the 37th parallel. It turns out that it's the northern border of Arizona, which means that the sun shines very brightly on the Korean Peninsula, even if it's cloudy. So think about that a little bit in terms of what the options for the future of renewable energy might be on the Korean Peninsula. So with that broadening of our focus, thank you all very much, and let's give our panel a round of applause.
And thank you also to Pierce for broadening our focus. That brings to a conclusion today's and this week's series of events. Thank you all very much for being part of it. As I mentioned earlier, next week we're changing tack a little bit. We have a lot of hands-on activities as well as a few more panels to go. On Monday morning, the first thing we're doing is a visit to the Atom Institute for those who have signed up. So once again, we will be leaving at 9 a.m. sharp from Wagramerstrasse, just by the U-Bahn station Kaisermühlen. We will be gathering people together from 8:30 a.m. at Gate 1. and we can lead you then down to the buses. So please be there, and I look forward to seeing you on Monday. Have a nice weekend. Thank you.